On April 16, 1945, a sunny spring morning in Germany, if you had stood on the road leading out of Weimar that morning, you would have seen something that made no sense. It was a march of hundreds of people moving up a hill. Men were seen in their tailored suits and fedora hats, while women were dressed in fur coats with lipstick on and high heels. They were moving in a single file. Some were chatting, some were smiling, and a few were even laughing, like they were heading to a party or an opera show. They complained as they walked. They muttered about the dust on their polished shoes and the inconvenience of the climb. To them, this was a propaganda stunt, a silly American game they just had to endure. They looked at the cameras with a smirk, confident in their innocence, while the American soldiers, grim-faced and dirty, kept their fingers on the triggers of their M1 Garands. The soldiers weren't smiling. They knew what was at the top of the hill. These people were the so-called elites of Weimar. They were the wealthy, the educated, and the aristocrats of Germany. But they were not going to a party. Flanking them on both sides were American soldiers. But they were liars, and Patton was about to break them. In order for you to understand what happened on April 16th, you have to understand who these people were, because this story is about the gap between who a person believes they are and what they have allowed to happen in their name. Weimar was the soul of Germany. It was not just any German city. It was the city of Goethe and Schiller, the birthplace of the Bauhaus movement and the Weimar Republic. Its people lived surrounded by libraries, theaters, and parks. They genuinely believed they were the pinnacle of European civilization. And yet, since 1937, a death factory had been running 5 miles up a tree-lined road from the theaters and cafes on Ettersberg Hill. The smoke coming from there had been rising above the trees for 8 years. The SS officers who ran the camp lived in the city's suburbs, and their wives shopped in the same boutiques and sat in the same theaters. Railroad tracks were carrying prisoners from the city station directly into the death factory in broad daylight, and anyone on that platform could see the men in striped uniforms through the gaps in the cattle car doors. When the Americans arrived, the citizens of Weimar had 4 words ready. Wir haben nichts gewusst. We knew nothing. Patton had heard enough. Buchenwald had been operating since July of 1937. In 8 years, more than 250,000 men and women from across Europe had passed through its gates. In April 1945, at least 56,000 of them had been murdered inside, and men were still dying at the rate of 40 per day when American soldiers arrived. The city of poets 5 miles below had spent 8 long years looking the other way. The SS officers were not strangers in Weimar. They were their neighbors. The smoke above the Ettersberg became familiar to them over time, and the smell that rose in the mornings became just the thing anybody mentioned at dinner. The skeletal men on the railroad were labeled as factory workers or volunteers. The city did not just tolerate Buchenwald. It accommodated it and normalized it, and then looked the American soldiers in the eye and said it had never known it existed. This was the lie that Patton was going to show them. Patton arrived at Buchenwald on April 13th, 2 days before the march. He had already seen Ohrdruf in its terrible state, and he thought that it was enough and it had prepared him, but he would get the biggest shocker when he found out that 20,000 prisoners were still inside. He saw walking skeletons, men who weighed 60 pounds, and children who had forgotten what it meant to smile. Patton walked through the gates and saw the pile of bodies in the courtyard, stacked like firewood, naked, yellow-skinned with their eyes still open. He wrote in his diary, "I have never felt so sick in my life." He described it as madness and not war. He stood at the gate and looked down toward Weimar, where civilians were plowing their land and hanging laundry in a morning that looked entirely ordinary, while the smell from the camp was strong enough to make his own soldiers vomit. He turned towards the camp commander and asked if the people in the town knew about the camp. The commander told him they claimed they did not. This turned Patton's face red, and he slammed his riding crop against his boot. "They are lying," he said, "and I am going to prove it." He called the provost marshal and gave an order unlike any other in the history of the war. He did not want the mayor or low-ranking officials. He told them to round up the doctors, the lawyers, the professors, the businessmen, and even the wives of politicians. They were the best people in the city. The MPs went to the grand villas, knocked on the polished front doors, and told the people inside to put on their coats. General Patton was inviting them to visit their neighbors. One man shouted that he was a doctor and could not be ordered around. The MP pointed his rifle and told the man to start walking. It was a strange sight, a long line of well-dressed citizens moving up the road, with American jeeps moving alongside them to make sure no one turned back. There was no tension at the start of the journey. Women were seen fixing their hair, people were chatting, and a few even smiled at the cameras along the road. They had decided this was an inconvenience. They would just endure and forget. Then the wind shifted, and the smell reached them. It was not the smell of a factory or a burning field. It was stale, heavy, and greasy, the kind that clings to the back of the throat and refuses to leave. Women stopped smiling and pulled out handkerchiefs and perfumed scarves, pressing them hard against their faces. Some stopped walking entirely, but the MPs pushed them forward without a word to keep on moving. They reached the iron gate of Buchenwald and read the inscription forged into the metal, "Jedem das Sein," which means to each his own. The phrase imprinted something harsh in their minds, for people who had spent their lives reading Goethe and Schiller. Someone had put it there as a joke aimed at people exactly like them. They walked through the gate and stepped out of their world entirely. The first thing they saw was the prisoners. Many of them were standing behind the barbed wire, watching in silence. These were the men the citizens had turned their eyes away from for 8 years, the ones they had seen at the train station and on work details in the city, the ones they had looked at and then looked away from. The prisoners did not shout or rush the fence. They stood absolutely still, and they stared. But their eyes held nothing except recognition. For the prisoners, they had seen these same clothes on those same streets for years, and those streets had never offered them anything. They did not attack. They just stared, but their stares were more powerful than any weapon. The soldiers formed a corridor and guided the civilians to the crematorium courtyard, where a transport trailer sat piled with naked, emaciated bodies. Their limbs were tangled together, and their mouths were still open. A woman in a fur coat raised her hand to her mouth and began to shake and scream. Due to the shock, she collapsed into the mud. An MP stepped forward, not to help her, but to nudge her boot with his own. "Get up," he said. "You haven't seen anything yet." They were led into the pathology building, where a table had been laid out with items the SS had collected and preserved. There were 2 shrunken heads, the heads of Polish prisoners. Several pieces of tattooed human skin were also placed along with lampshades made from human skin, ordered by Ilse Koch, the commandant's wife, who had developed a liking for the tattoos on prisoners' bodies and arranged for those prisoners to be killed so she could keep the skin as decoration. Men in suits were weeping openly, and some were vomiting in the corners. An American officer who spoke perfect German stood beside the table and addressed them. "You say you did not know?" he said. "These were made here in your backyard, while you were at the theater and drinking your coffee." But no one could answer him. The tour continued and moved through the barracks, where men were lying in the three-tier bunks because they were too sick to stand, staring up at the ceiling with hollow eyes. The stench had no comparison in ordinary life. Then they moved to the quarantine zone, where prisoners had been left to die of typhus. The American soldiers in that section wore masks, but the civilians were not given masks. And then, in the middle of the tour, something happened that no record could have staged. A former prisoner, barely able to stand, walked toward a well-dressed banker and raised a shaking finger. "I remember you," he said. "I worked at the train station. I saw you and you saw me. But you looked away." The banker fell to his knees and sobbed. "I didn't know," he said, but nobody believed him, not even himself. By the time the tour ended, the citizens of Weimar were not the same people who had walked up that hill in the morning. They walked out in total silence. The women's makeup were streaked with tears, and the men's suits were gray with dust. They were moved back down the road without a word, through the same green countryside that had felt so ordinary 2 hours before. One older woman said quietly that they had been applauding Goethe at the theater while people were dying on the hill above their city. In the days that followed, several prominent citizens took their own lives. They could not reconcile the image of themselves as civilized people with the reality of what their silence had permitted. Patton was told about the suicides. He did not celebrate, and he did not mourn. He said, "Maybe the rest of them will learn." Eisenhower heard about Patton's march and did not reprimand him. He expanded it, cabling Washington and London, ordering the press, film crews, congressmen, and parliament members to visit the camps. "I made the visit deliberately," Eisenhower said, "in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." He knew denial would come, so he forced the Germans to become witnesses against themselves. These are the kinds of stories that get buried, softened, and eventually forgotten. And that is exactly why we are here. If this story deserved to be told, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Do you think the citizens of Weimar truly did not know? Or were they lying to protect themselves? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. We read every one. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division faced their own breaking point just days later at a place called Dachau. What they did when they walked through those gates is a story the Army tried to bury for over 40 years. That video is waiting for you on this channel right now.